Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I take it that the aim of conceptual engineering is to improve our concepts. So projects in conceptual engineering aim to iron out conceptual muddles, sometimes promote scientific progress or justice or other good things. And that to engage in successful conceptual engineering, we'd need to be able to firstly figure out how concepts are defective and how they might be improved, and then to bring about conceptual change. And it seems to me that in the literature on conceptual engineering, there's a strain of thought that has it that one, it might be fairly easy. So it might be fairly easy to figure out how concepts are defective and how they might be made better, but that bringing about conceptual change might be really hard. So a couple of quotes. So Kaplan's got his book on conceptual engineering, but he's notably pessimistic about conceptual engineering projects actually being successful. So he likens projects in conceptual engineering to other large-scale normative projects. So if you were hoping to bring about world peace or get everyone to give lots of money to charity, you wouldn't hold out much hope of success. He seems to be similarly pessimistic about projects in conceptual engineering actually working. So in this quote here, he finishes by saying, anyone who spends time thinking and talking about large-scale normative matters should do so without holding out too much hope. More recently, so this is a forthcoming paper by Andau called Conceptual Engineering is Extremely Unlikely to Work, So What? So it's an interesting paper, and Andau does a kind of back of an envelope cost-benefit analysis. So his view is that conceptual engineering projects are exceedingly unlikely to succeed, but that the payoffs would be so massive that it's worth giving it a go. So he thinks that if we were to manage to improve our concept of justice or our concepts around gender, then that might bring huge benefits for centuries. And so it's worth trying. So he says, I'm urging for optimism about conceptual engineering on the basis that it seems the prospective payoffs might more than make up for the small chances of success. Now, what I'm going to try to do is, so it seems to me that discussions in conceptual engineering are hugely interesting. It seems to me that they're somewhat divorced from discussions in philosophy of science. And I think that's a bit odd in that I think that lots of philosophers of science spend their time trying to figure out conceptual muddles in the various sciences and aim at sorting them out. So I think lots of the projects there are similar to kind of conceptual engineering projects. I think that the discussions can get a little bit abstract, and I'm going to offer some real life examples. Through the examples that I'm going to offer, I'm going to suggest that, at least in some domains and in some contexts, bringing about conceptual change might be pretty easy. But so that's the optimistic bit. The problem is that Andau seems to think that once concepts have been engineered, they will stay good for many, many years. In my examples, I'm going to suggest that might not be the case, and that conceptual maintenance might be required. And I'm also going to suggest that figuring out whether and when concepts are defective and how they might be improved can also be pretty difficult. So the examples I'm going to discuss all have to do with the DSM. So mainly I work on the DSM. So the DSM is a classification and a big book. So it's a classification of mental disorders. It gets published by the American Psychiatric Association. When you open the DSM, it contains sets of diagnostic criteria for all the various mental disorders. And these diagnostic criteria. They're kind of checklists. So to have a diagnosis of depression, for example, I think it's 5 out of 9 symptoms you need to have. So the symptoms are things like feeling hopeless, losing interest in your normal activities, losing your appetite, and so on. If you get enough of these symptoms and you've had them for the appropriate amount of time, then you count as being depressed. So the DSM contains these sets of diagnostic criteria. It gets revised regularly. So every 15 years or so it gets revised. When it gets revised, it's a really big deal. So it's a big book. And when it gets revised, that takes many years. So it'll be between 10 and 5 years will be spent revising the DSM. And there are committees. So for each part of the book, there's a committee who thinks about how it needs to be revised. So there's be a committee looking at types of depression, a committee looking at childhood disorders and so on. And it's hugely influential. So the DSM gets used in training mental health researchers and clinicians around the world. It gets used by researchers to pick out subject populations for research and so on. So just to bring out some features of psychiatric kinds, or I take it psychiatric concepts go with psychiatric kinds. So when the DSM committees decide to put a new disorder into the DSM, they construct a psychiatric kind, they construct a psychiatric concept, and that has a massive impact. So it means that a bunch of people can be diagnosed with that condition. Obviously, that impacts the kind of treatment that they receive. Very often, psychiatric diagnoses have some harmful effects. So most psychiatric disorders are stigmatized to a greater or lesser extent. The other thing that I think is interesting about psychiatric kinds and psychiatric concepts is that they have transparent origins. So to a first approximation, they get created in committees in kind of minuted meetings. So the committees discuss what it is they're trying to do, and they reach a decision as to whether they're going to include a new category or not. So these kinds and concepts that are intentionally created. And the other interesting thing about these kinds and concepts is that the American Psychiatric Association, I think, is kind of open to conceptual engineering in a sense. So the American Psychiatric Association wants the classification to be better. And it's regularly revised. And so when diagnostic criteria are unclear or there's a contradiction, sometimes when people point that out to them, they change them. And they are also mindful of the fact that psychiatric diagnoses quite often do lead to unintentional harm, and they're interested in revising the classification to try to minimize that. So this is a not terribly good diagram trying to show which groups have an input into the DSM when it's revised. So as I said, when it's revised, that's a big project. The most important people when the DSM is being revised are the committee members. So the committee members will almost all be psychiatrists. So there'll be people conducting research in the relevant areas. And they consider what revisions might be necessary. When the DSM is revised, it's a long drawn out process. So what happens is that various draft proposals get made public, and clinicians and researchers in the wider community can then offer feedback on those. So in the run up to the DSM coming out, there will be lots of conferences and journal special issues in psychiatry where people are discussing proposed revisions. Pharmaceutical companies have an influence, but kind of indirectly. So most research in psychiatry is funded by pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, they fund research that fits with their interests. So in that way, they shape the research base, and then the research base gets reviewed when the DSM is being revised. There are legal and bureaucratic systems that play some role. So drafts of the DSM get given to legal people to see if they think there's going to be any problems caused, particularly in forensic settings. People from insurance companies will get asked whether it's likely to cause problems for the way that medical insurance works. Patient groups will lobby the American Psychiatric Association to get the classification changed one way or the other. Right at the top in a tiny box, I've put philosophers, and it would be smaller, except that philosophers is quite a long word, so I couldn't make it kind of smaller. So philosophers potentially have a tiny little influence in that some of the people who write the DSM are quite interested in philosophy of psychiatry. So some of the people who write the DSM will come and hang out at philosophy of psychiatry conferences, they'll read some philosophical work, and there's a bit of interaction there. What's happened? Oh, there we are. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this paper is, firstly, I'm going to offer some encouraging examples drawn from the processes whereby the DSM is revised. So I think these are examples where they might offer conceptual engineers some reason for hope. So some examples where it looks like conceptual engineering in the DSM kind of works, and then things take a darker turn, and I'm going to discuss some puzzling and worrying examples. But first of all, for the encouraging examples. So the first example I want to discuss has to do with the definition of mental disorder that is included in the introduction of the classification system. So since the DSM-III, which came out in 1980, the DSM has included a definition of mental disorder in the introduction. And the definition that's included there developed out of the debates in the late 60s and early 70s about homosexuality. So many of you will know that homosexuality used to be considered a mental disorder, and so it used to be included in the DSM. In the late 60s, early 70s, there were big protests about that. So gay rights groups protested. They wanted homosexuality taken out of the DSM. There was a massive debate within psychiatry. So various people started doing studies. They found out that homosexuality is more common than they'd previously thought. They found out that homosexual people are in many respects like everybody else. And so there was this debate that went on. And then what happened eventually is that in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association allowed its members to vote. So all the American psychiatrists had a vote. They decided that homosexuality shouldn't be considered a mental disorder, and it got taken out of the DSM. And in these debates, defining disorder played a role. So, as I said, there were some empirical studies that were relevant to the debate, but there was also discussion of conceptual issues. So there were papers being written by prominent psychiatrists where they argued that homosexuality shouldn't be considered a mental disorder because it didn't meet the definition of mental disorder. And in particular, they argued that it's conceptually necessary for a condition to cause harm to the patient for it to appropriately be considered a mental disorder. And then in the case of homosexuality, insofar as in itself it doesn't cause you any harm to be gay, being homosexual didn't meet the definition of disorder. So out of these debates came about a definition of disorder, which was included in the DSM. So the DSM, as I said, it gets revised fairly often. So the first version of this definition got into the DSM-III in 1980. The one I've got for you here, this is the 1994 version. But the gist of it is that a disorder has to be harmful. So it's quite long. It's not written quite as a philosopher would write it, but you've got in the first part here the idea that a mental disorder is some kind of syndrome, that it occurs occurs within a person. And then the second bit is that it's associated with some kind of harm. So it's associated with present distress or disability or risk of suffering, death or disability or something like that. But you've got the basic idea that something can only be a disorder if it causes harm. So I think that we can see this as an example of conceptual engineering in the process of producing the DSM. So a consensus emerged in these debates that a condition can only be considered a disorder if it's harmful. This can be seen as kind of conceptual improvement. So as a result of this consensus emerging, homosexual people cease to be thought of as having a mental disorder. The debate looked kind of philosophical. So papers were being written where it looked like there were psychiatrists engaging in kind of conceptual analysis type stuff. The debate was taking seriously the question of what we ought to consider a mental disorder. Later on in the debate, philosophers played a role to some extent, and there was this consensus that developed that something should only be considered a disorder if it's harmful. So that's my first kind of encouraging example, a case where I think we can see it as a case of kind of successful conceptual engineering with the definition of disorder in the DSM. I've got another encouraging example. So this example has to do with the diagnostic criteria for paraphilias. So paraphilias are sexual perversions. So things like sadism, paedophilia, things like that. And in the 2000 edition, there was a mistake. So there was a mistake in the diagnostic criteria. So in the text, it talked about fantasies, urges, or behaviours, when it should have been fantasies, urges, and behaviours. So there was a mistake, a conceptual error, and this led to a problem. And the reason it led to a problem was that because it was possible to diagnose someone solely on the basis of their behaviour rather than also on the basis of their kind of ongoing fantasies and preferences, it meant that sex offenders could be diagnosed solely on the basis of their offending behaviour. And in the United States, there are quite a lot of states that had sexually violent predator laws, which meant that once somebody had been convicted for a sexual offence, and if they were diagnosed with a paraphilia, then they could be detained indefinitely. And so this conceptual error led to what Alan Francis terms one royal fuck up. And I like that quote because Francis is quite a posh psychiatrist, and he's the man who is in charge of this edition of the DSM. So here you've got a conceptual error and it leads to big problems. Francis blames the lawyers for this problem. So he said, look, the diagnostic criteria were written with careful attention to clinical detail, but are not nearly precise enough to meet the different needs and outlooks of the legal system. Psychiatric language often stands up poorly to the nitpicking scrutiny that characterises adversarial legal argument. Legal and psychiatric truths are very different animals. But here again, I think this case kind of fits with a kind of conceptual engineering narrative in that this is a case where there's a conceptual error, like there's a mix-up between an and an or, that causes problems, and then the way that the problems get fixed is that there's conceptual revision to the diagnostic criteria for paraphilias, so that issue gets taken care of. So those are two examples where I think the cases where things work out quite nicely, where it looks like conceptual engineering is kind of achievable and can do some good. But now I have some more depressing examples. So these are examples where things don't work out so well. There's going to be a number of them. So the first difficulty that I want to highlight is that. So when the committees are thinking how to revise the DSM, they do try to consider what the likely consequences are going to be for patients. So they do think about whether the changes they make to the diagnostic criteria are likely to cause problems or to benefit people. But even though they can try and predict what the consequences of tweaking the criteria this way or that way might be, their predictions often go completely wrong. That's for a number of reasons, just to mention some of them. So one reason why it's very, very hard to predict what the consequences will be of introducing a new condition into the DSM or changing the boundaries of a psychiatric concept is that, to a certain extent, the costs and benefits that a patient suffers from receiving a diagnosis depend on the treatment they're given. And of course, drugs get developed in ways that are unpredictable, and they also get employed in ways that are unpredictable. And so that's part of the reason why it's hard to predict what the consequences are going to be. Another reason why predictions often go wrong is that in many cases, the DSM committees, their estimates as to what the prevalence of a diagnosis are going to be have been completely wrong. I'm going to discuss an example of that in a minute. And obviously that makes a big difference, because to a large extent, whether a new diagnostic category is going to do good or cause harm depends on how many people you think are going to receive that diagnosis. And this is a point that Ian Hacking's developed a lot in his work on looping effects in humankinds. How people respond to receiving a particular diagnosis can be really hard to predict. So I just want to give you an example which illustrates how hard it can be to estimate what the prevalence of a condition will turn out to be. So autism has been in the DSM from 1980. But what's happened over time is many, many, many more people have come to be considered autistic. So in 1989 in the US, it was estimated that 1 in 2,500 kids were autistic. In 2012, the estimate is 1 in 88. And it's controversial exactly what's gone on there. So there are some people who think that for some reason, more people with kind of neuroatypical brains are being born. So that's one possibility. But it's highly plausible to think that in part, at least part of this massive increase has to do with a particular court decision. So in 1991, there was a court decision in the United States, which meant that when kids were diagnosed with autism, they had to be eligible. It meant they were eligible for special education services, and that meant that there was an advantage to kids being diagnosed with autism, particularly compared to being diagnosed with various types of intellectual disability. And so it's likely that that court decision, which was kind of unpredictable, ended up making a massive increase to the prevalence rates. And if the court decision had gone the other way, then presumably things would have been different. So that's one example which illustrates how hard estimating prevalence can be. Another related example. So Asperger's was introduced into the DSM in 1994, and the committee minutes about that decision are interesting in that. So the committees debated this and they ended up saying, yeah, we might as well introduce it because it's hardly going to be used, this diagnosis anyway. So they really thought that Asperger's would be incredibly rare and almost nobody would get this diagnosis, and that they might as well have it in there. They put it in there because they wanted to be compatible with a different classification system from the World Health Organization. But they didn't think it was going to be a big deal. And then, of course, what actually happened is, it became to be very widely diagnosed, which they hadn't predicted. It also came to be a psychiatric diagnosis where quite a lot of people didn't mind being diagnosed as having Asperger's. So people came to self-identify as having Asperger's, and communities were built around the label. So for at least some people, it was in some ways a positive thing to have an Asperger's diagnosis. So it meant that you could kind of find other people like you and hang out, you know, with online communities and so on. And that wasn't predicted at all. And then what happened in the most recent edition of the DSM is that Asperger's was removed. So it was removed as a standalone diagnosis. So in the past, you could receive a diagnosis of Asperger's. Now you can't. Now you get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which lumps together the people who used to be diagnosed with Asperger's and the people who used to be diagnosed with autism. And in the run-up to the DSM-5 being published, there was some debate about this, and quite a lot of people, including myself, thought that getting rid of Asperger's would be unfortunate, because there were these communities of people who referred to themselves as Aspies. There were these communities where there were people who self-identified as being Asperger's. That seemed to be, you know, a positive thing for them. And the worry was that if the condition was removed from the DSM, then that would cause damage to those communities. But actually what happened is that the communities that used to identify as being Aspie communities, at least in the UK, have just re-identified. So now in the UK, people who once would have described themselves as being Asperger's people now just refer to themselves as being autistic people. So I guess what I want to say with these examples is that the committee is responsible for revising the DSM. It's like they try to revise the classification to minimise harms to patient populations and well, they try to do good insofar as they're able to when they're constructing the classification. But this is incredibly hard when the effects of revisions are so unpredictable. And so these examples are from Psychiatry. Ian Hackins talks a lot about how whenever it comes to revising or constructing humankinds or revising the concepts that go with humankinds, you can end up with unpredictable effects. And that makes it very hard to try to engineer kinds or concepts in a way to make the world a better place when their consequences are so unpredictable. So that's my first set of reasons for pessimism. The next has to do again with the definition of mental disorder in the introduction to the DSM. So in the earlier part of the paper, I'd presented this as an example of kind of successful conceptual engineering. You know, like there'd been this consensus that developed that something should only be considered a disorder if it caused a patient harm. This had gone into the DSM. It had meant, amongst other things, that homosexual people no longer counted as having a mental disorder. And I'd offered this as an example of progressive conceptual engineering. But with the most recent edition of the DSM, that story all goes horribly wrong. The most recent edition of the DSM came out in 2013. As I said, revising the DSM is a big job, so it takes many years to produce the revision. So by late 2011, the DSM-5 was almost complete in the sense that almost all of the revisions to the sets of diagnostic criteria had already been decided. So most of the DSM was all sorted out. And then in December 2011, the American Psychiatric Association, they released a final draft. And in this final draft, there is a proposal to revise the definition of disorder. And this kind of took people in the philosophy of psychiatry by surprise. So everyone had thought that it had been established that there was this consensus that something can only be a disorder if it causes harm to the patient. And then at this very late stage, this consensus was kind of blown apart. So in this late draft, the draft offered two definitions of disorder. So one was in the tradition that I've been talking of so far. So one was a definition where harm is necessary for disorder. And that was developed by a group which included some philosophers. But then there was also a competing definition the competing definition had been developed by another group and it had nothing about harm in it at all. So there were these two competing definitions. And then there was a little note which said that a decision would be made later. And at this stage, almost everything about the DSM had been sorted out. And most things about the DSM are really controversial. So if the committees suggest a revision to like the autism criteria or the criteria for like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or whatever, then for years and years, psychiatrists will be debating that. They'll have special conferences, they'll have special journal issues, and it's a really big deal. With this proposal to change the definition of disorder, it was done very late on and nobody in psychiatry cared. So there was no big debate about this. It was just kind of an afterthought. So when everything else had been sorted out, there was this proposal to maybe change the definition and there was going to be some decision made later. What happened when the DSM-5 was finally published is that the definition, I think, can only really be understood as a kind of crude compromise between the two definitions that have been developed by these competing groups. So what you've got here is the first bit says that there's some kind of dysfunction. The second bit says in a long-winded kind of way that there's some kind of harm, but then in the middle you've got this usually associated. So I think it's intended as a kind of compromise between a proposed definition where harm is necessary for disorder, another proposed definition where harm isn't mentioned at all, and you've got them kind of shoved together with this usually associated in here. So what's happened here? Well, as I said, from the late 70s up until kind of 2012, defining disorder looked like a kind of philosophically respectable project in conceptual engineering, and then it all went horribly wrong. And the thing to note here is that psychiatrists aren't worried about this at all. So they've got this definition of mental disorder. To a philosopher, it looks like really, really awful, but nobody in psychiatry cares at all. So what we've got here is we've got a community where they're just not currently interested in kind of getting conceptually clear definitions. And in the case of psychiatry, one thing that's interesting is that in the debates about homosexuality, there were prominent psychiatrists who were writing papers where they did look quite like the kind of papers that philosophers produce, you know, like they were kind of thinking about the concept of disorder and how it ought to be defined and so on. Now, that's gone. They're just not interested anymore. And so what to say about this? Well, one thought, so we might kind of think, oh, well, they've just kind of made a mistake and it would be better if they wanted to have nice definitions like philosophers might write. So you might kind of think, well, here there's a need for kind of conceptual maintenance. There's a need for them to be educated into the right way of thinking about definitions. But one thing to note here is that in communities of people who aren't philosophers, there are lots of people who are quite tolerant of kind of conceptual confusion, and there are contexts in which conceptual confusion can serve some purposes. So in the case of the DSM definition, it's seen as a way of achieving compromise. Hart's got some interesting stuff on the way that laws get written. So he talks about the open texture of the language that gets used in law and how that can enable flexible decisions to be made in the future. So basically, one advantage of having a really unclear definition of disorder is that it means that down the line, the DSM committees can include or exclude whatever they want from the classification. I've got another depressing case. So this is another case where there's a mix-up between an and an or. So this time, so this is the diagnostic criteria for something called pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And that's a kind of autism-like condition. So it's a diagnosis for people where they don't meet all the criteria for autism, but they've got something in that kind of ballpark. And what you've got here is, again, you've got an or in the criteria when it should be an and. So the first bit says that there's a severe and pervasive impairment in the development of reciprocal social interaction or verbal and non-verbal communication skills. So it's an autism-like kind of condition. And then they've written or where stereotype behaviour, interests and activities are present. And that all's a mistake. If you read these criteria literally, then it means that if you have someone who's quite happy but very eccentric, so like they're really just interested in train timetables, but you know, like they've got friends, they're going around in their life okay, they meet the diagnostic criteria here. So this or it is a mistake, but it caused no problems whatsoever. And this is a little bit weird because pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified is a diagnosis that got used a lot. So in some areas it got diagnosed more than autism. So it's a diagnostic criteria, got used a lot. There's a mistake in it. If it's read literally, it means that you could use it to diagnose people where they're just, they've got stereotype behaviours and interests, but like they're otherwise all right. It didn't cause any problems. And it seems that the people using the DSM just either they didn't notice it or they just ignored it. And there must have been like, you know, thousands of psychiatrists using the DSM. They're supposed to be using the DSM criteria and they don't notice the difference between an or and an and. And one of the things that's interesting is that there's very little research being done on how psychiatrists actually use the DSM, but I think it's safe to say that they don't read it like philosophers do. So one thing that I think happens as a result of philosophical training is that philosophers are quite alert to kind of ands and ors, and like, you know, we're trained to look out for counterexamples. Psychiatrists don't read like that. So there's some suggestions that psychiatrists depend on prototypes when they diagnose people. But what you've got here is a case where there is an error, doesn't cause any problems at all because fairly much nobody notices it. So it gets corrected into the next edition. When it's corrected kind of quietly for complicated kind of public relations reasons. So it's a mistake. When it's a mistake, nobody notices it. When it's corrected quietly, so nobody will have noticed that it's been corrected either. Now, you might say that that's the case where the psychiatrist just got lucky. So there was a conceptual mistake. It didn't cause any problems, but that's just by luck. You know, just because nobody noticed it. The example I've got now is worse in that this is an example where there's an intentionally introduced contradiction. This example has to do with tic conditions. So tic conditions are things like Tourette's. So it's where people have involuntary motor movements, or they might shout things out. And the interesting thing about tic conditions is that there's lots of people who tic, but where it doesn't bother them and it doesn't cause them any problems. Now, in the DSM-IV, so that's the 1994 version, which I've already spoken about, there's the introductory definition of disorder that required harm. So in the DSM-IV, if you ticked, but it didn't cause you any problems, you wouldn't count as having a mental disorder because the introductory definition required harm. And also the diagnostic criteria for tic conditions. So like when you go to like the tic condition chapter, in the diagnostic criteria it has there, they also require harm. So in the DSM-IV, somebody who tics, but where it doesn't cause them any problems, can't be diagnosed. But tic researchers were unhappy about this, and they're unhappy about it because it seemed to them that people who tic plausibly tic because there's some neurological dysfunction. And so the tic researchers wanted to be able to diagnose people even if it didn't cause them any problems in their lives. So the tic researchers lobbied to get the diagnostic criteria for tic disorders changed so that you could diagnose people who ticked as having a disorder, even if it didn't cause them any bother. And they were kind of successful. So in the next edition, the diagnostic criteria for tic disorders were changed. So in the chapter on tic conditions, if you're following the diagnostic criteria there, you can diagnose someone where there isn't any harm. The introductory definition was still the same as it was before. So the introductory definition says you can't have a mental disorder unless there is harm. So in the text, there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction between what it says in the introduction and what it says in the criteria for tic disorders. But in practice, everybody was quite happy with this contradiction. Indeed, like they deliberately inserted it. And again, this is seen as a way of achieving compromise. And I guess one thing to note is that the DSM is a really big book. So tic researchers, it's like if they want to diagnose people who tic but don't have any problems, they can just go and look at their chapter, and their chapter will allow them to do that. It contradicts what it says in the introductory definition, but nobody's too bothered about that. So this kind of thing bothers me because it seems to me that it's a fundamental working assumption of lots of work in the philosophy of science and probably kind of conceptual engineering projects more generally, that conceptual confusions can be identified by reading scientific texts. So if you're a philosopher of science, what you do is you kind of read what it says, and like if something's contradictory, you take that as a problem, you know. So as someone working in the philosophy of psychiatry, it's like I spend my time reading the DSM. If there's a contradiction, I kind of think, oh, that's kind of bad, you know, that's a problem. But what we've seen in some of these cases is that psychiatrists and quite probably other communities of users, so other scientific communities, they just don't read scientific texts as a philosopher would. And so that means that they can read something that contains, you know, like an or instead of an and. They don't even see it. They can read things that look contradictory and not worry about it at all. And that problematizes the idea, I think, that the way to spot conceptual confusions is by reading scientific texts, because philosophers just don't read in the same way that other people do. We've also seen some cases where there's conceptual confusions that don't cause any problems, and where the communities responsible for creating the classification sometimes intentionally mess up their concepts, in that they intentionally insert contradictions, insert things that are unclear, and they can see that as a way of facilitating compromise or flexibility or something like that. So we've got cases where philosophers of science kind of come along and point out to a community, look, your concepts are a mess, you know, like, let's sort them out, it'll be so much better. So there's kind of normative projects, but not all communities are going to be interested in philosophy style kind of conceptual engineering. And as I said, in some contexts, there are communities who see value in kind of conceptual mess. So this is the end, and this is where in part I'm looking for your help. So what I think these examples show is that in the context of the DSM, I think bringing about conceptual change is fairly easy. And so the committees responsible for the DSM, they do it on a regular schedule. So, you know, like they rewrite their book, psychiatrists get trained in it, and they go on and kind of use it. But there are lots and lots of difficulties. So I've talked about how projects that aim at improving our concepts and making the world better for people, at least in areas like psychiatry, are really hard. And one of the things that I'm working on is whether there's any way to predict at all what the consequences are going to be of, you know, introducing new psychiatric kinds or revising them. I'm also worried about cases, as we've seen here, where you get slippage between what a text literally says and how it's interpreted by the communities who use it. And I think that can mean that spotting conceptual confusions can be very, well, it's hard to know where to look. You know, like if you can't just kind of read the text and see whether there's a contradiction or not, it's hard for a philosopher to know kind of what to do. I think it also problematizes where conceptual fixes ought to be located. If you can get a mismatch between what a text literally says and how the communities of reader interpret it. And then I'm also worried that philosophers kind of offer conceptual goods that many scientific communities might just not want. And one of the things I'm interested in is looking at and trying to understand how it is that scientific communities are sometimes interested in kind of conceptual clarity and ironing out conceptual confusions and listening to what philosophers have to say, and then sometimes they're not at all. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much.